So, what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the fact that all the Welsh people have been freed from football jail in the repressive state of Qatar and can now fly home to freedom. But if you want that explained, you can get it somewhere else, because we're going to move on to page 6, where, as I said, it's the official start of the winter of discontent as post workers, sixth form staff and university lecturers all start strikes today. Now, the railways are going to see another 4 days of strikes in the run-up to Christmas. Train cleaners are downing tools for 3 days, including New Year's Eve. And here, it looks like the Royal College of Nursing says 100,000 nurses are set to walk out of the NHS for 2 days on December the 15th and 20th. So don't trip over and bang your head then. Ashley, let's take this one step at a time, Ash. The whole point of striking is to cause disruption and inconvenience. And this many people in this many jobs is going to be far more noticeable, isn't it, than just, say, a picket line outside a sorting office?
Oh, yeah, I mean, completely. You've got 100,000 nurses now that belong to the Royal College of Nursing now. It's their first strike in 106 years in their existence. So they've announced their strikes for December. I think at first they're going to have half their workforce in England going out. And then you also notice in the story as well, like last night, that the Unison Union came out and announced that in the first time in 30 years there as well, that ambulance workers will be going out on strike. So we're talking about 999 callers here as well, not just nurses. And the GMB union later today will announce whether their members, who are also ambulance workers, will go out before Christmas. So we could see this coordinated strike here between ambulance workers and nurses during the winter, which is going to have a huge disruption on the NHS, especially at a time when the government is so concerned about the backlog. We've got 7.5 million people waiting for non-urgent treatment and cancer services. So the ramifications of this are going to be enormous. And at the same time, there seems to be this sort of brinkmanship between the government and the unions. And Steve Barclay is suggesting that these demands are unaffordable. I mean, what's unaffordable to many of those people working in the health service is the cost of living, eating into their incomes, and sort of soaring price of energy bills and food prices.
Exactly. This is it's the brinkmanship I don't quite see, I can't quite understand. The issue, I suppose, is whether the public have a lot of support for this. So, I mean, get into the comments, everybody. Let us know your questions. Do you support the nurses and the ambulance workers going out and strike, the call handlers, all these other people? Do you think they're justified in doing that? Are you concerned about use of the NHS in that time? Are you waiting for an outpatient appointment that's being put back and put back and put back? Are you one of the 7 million? Let us know. I know my dad is, because he's still waiting for hearing aids and that keeps getting put back. But that's not urgent, is it? Quite the same way. The issue, I suppose, is whether, Ash, these strikes are actually going to work in terms of bringing the government to the table and getting some more pay. So there's lots of unions and jobs involved here, and they all want different things, but by and large, they want more money for their members to deal with inflation, as you say, and the cost of living. The bosses and the government say that they can't afford it, but the workers are saying, well, they can't afford to live without it. So leaving Royal Mail aside for a bit, which is a private company, the others all have their pay set or sort of somehow influenced by the government, don't they? So they can fix this if they want to. Why don't they want to, Ash?
I mean, it's the independent bodies that the government have set up which agree the pay rises for nurses and different
the independent bodies who always seem to do exactly what the government want them to do. How completely independent?
But I think the government see this as if they sort of fall to the demands of one union, that they're going to have to cater to the demands of all of them. And particularly at the moment, I mean, last night as well, you also got, so 2 weeks ago, the civil servants, 100,000 members voted to go on strike as well. And that's at 124 government departments. You're talking about the Home Office, the Department for Work and Pensions. So last night, you got the first two of those government departments. I think it was the the Driving Examiners Department and
the DVLA.
DVLA, right. And the Rural Payments Agency. So they're both going on strike, rolling regional strikes from December till January. So these are going to impact driving tests across the country. And that's just the first 2 of 124 government departments organised by the Public Commercial Services Union. And on top of that, you have the posties, you've got the university staff, you've got the NHS staff, possibly junior doctors in the future, teachers. I mean, the government is going to have to do something. It is going to have to move to prevent this sort of winter of discontent that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I don't really see how it can block pay rises for all of those people. And it's going to have to start, negotiating here or there. The Rural Payments Agency goes out. They're the people who organise the subsidy payments to farmers all over the country. So, farmers are going to find that they don't have money in their bank account that month if those things carry on. Now, Nick says, I'm behind these strikes. They have a right to be paid a living wage and not have to accept, for example, 0 hours contracts. We do have a right to strike. Everybody should have a right to strike. I don't, because I'm freelance. If I go out to strike, I just don't get paid. And no one cares if I just stop working, apart from our few regular listeners here, of course. But, they've got a lot of public support so far for these strikes, Ash, it's fair to say. Yep. But they haven't really kicked in yet, have they? They haven't really fully started. The full list of the NHS staff who might strike includes, as you already mentioned, the 999 call handlers, ambulance technicians, paramedics, cleaners, hospital porters, hospital pharmacists, admin staff, midwives, and junior doctors, never mind the nurses, of course. If they all go out, Ash, it becomes something of an NHS-wide strike, doesn't it? The entire NHS just stops. If the pharmacists aren't there, who's dispensing the medicines? Can the government really afford to let it get that far? Or is it's going to have to come to the table? It's going to have to tumble at some point, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is the government can't afford to let it go that far. I mean, we were talking earlier about the NHS backlog. I mean, I think Rishi Sunak in the summer during the Tory leadership contest was suggesting that this would be one of his number one priorities. I think we've seen in recent weeks he's got a lot of number one priorities, and it's a bit unclear which one of those is the number one priority. But at the same time, you'll see the story that's just below this piece in the paper, which is Steve Barclay and the Health Department being wrapped by the UK Statistics Authority for putting out basically dodgy and misleading graphs on nurses' pay, sort of exaggerating the increase of it. And this isn't really the way to conduct negotiations, is to annoy the unions and sort of, I think we're using the word gaslighting. So the government should be getting around the table and thrashing out a deal instead of putting out misleading graphs on social media, exaggerating the scale of nurses, how much nurses' pay has gone up in recent years. Yeah,
and of course, Transport Secretaries refused to meet Mick Lynch, things like that. So there have been issues where they haven't come to the table at all, isn't it?
It's worth saying with the Transport Secretary, he's definitely adopted a more conciliatory tone than his predecessor, Grant Shapps. So Mark Harper's actually getting around the table and discussing with the RMT steps forward. So you have, I think last week, Mick Lynch came out of the meeting outside the Department for Transport. We were standing outside there. And after one protester disappeared who said God was coming before Mick Lynch arrived, after Mick Lynch briefly hid behind a post, so he didn't want to get involved in that protester, he appeared back and he said he had a positive meeting with Mark Harper, the new Transport Secretary. But he said there obviously still are stumbling blocks. They've got to discuss pay, pensions, etc. But whether we're closer to a deal, I think that's uncertain. The unions, the RMT particularly, is still waiting for a letter from the Department for Transport, sort of setting out the mandate for.
Well, they won't get the letter because the posties have gone out on strike.
Exactly.
It does at least go to show that, Grant Shapps, he said that he couldn't negotiate and it was nothing to do with him, rail pay. Exactly. And then Mark Harper has come to the table and is negotiating exactly that. So it just goes to show Grant Shapps was wrong. And the issue here, I think, is ideology, isn't it? And how things look, rather than whether or not they're capable of fixing it. Now, Mike says, the government says it can't afford a decent pay rise for nurses, but it had no problem finding billions for PPE contracts for their mates, billions for HS2, and wanted to spend hundreds of millions of pounds on a royal yacht. There's always money when they want to spend it on their projects. He's got a point, hasn't he, Ash? It's when we want it spent on us, there's always a bit of an argument.
He certainly does have a point. I mean, it's worth saying the royal yacht, I think, was binned by Rishi Sunak last week. It's disposing of another one of Boris Johnson's legacies. But I think you had a story on Monday as well, which was discussing the scale of COVID loan fraud as well during the pandemic. And that was sort of reached sort of £4 or £5 billion. This is such a huge scale of money. I mean, governments always find money down the back of the sofa. I don't think you can remember Theresa May during the 2017 general election campaign, the sort of ill-fated election gamble, when there was a particular moment during one of the debates when she turned around to a nurse who was struggling with the cost of living at that moment, and she just turned around to her and said, "There's no magic money tree." And then, sort of after the election, when her political authority was sort of evaporated, she suddenly found money to end the pay freeze of the public sector.
Yeah, there is no magic money tree except when we want to see the magic money tree. 2017, it seems like a lifetime ago now, Ash. So much has happened since then. Crikey, it's only 5 years. How much younger and less grey we all were at the time. Now, Jonathan says, it's years of Tory neglect catching up with them. We have had 12 years of Tory rule, and a good, I suppose, 7 or 8 years of them have been ideological rather than the first few, probably a bit more practical, but it's not been good, has it? Now, keep asking your questions. What do you think about all these strikes? Are you joining them? Are you worried about them? Are you concerned about how you're going to get to work? Let us know. But the one obvious thing which occurs in all this, Ash, before we move on to the next story, is that at what point we start calling this a general strike. Now, in 1926, which is almost a century ago now, that was the first general strikes when almost every union walked out. The unions then were massive. We had a lot of heavy industry. It made a massive difference to the country. Today, the economy is far more services based, but the public sector is a third of the working population, pretty much. If large parts of it stop work for a day or two, including the civil service, which keeps everything on the tracks, and we will know all about it. Do you think, Ash, that we're going to escalate to the point where we are going to be calling this a general strike at some point over the winter? Or is that too much of a worry?
I think the idea of a general strike is a bit of a misnomer, to be honest, because, I mean, largely due to the anti-trade union laws that we have in this country that have been introduced since the 1920s. I think in the 1920s, you had sort of industries walking out in sympathy with other unions.
Yeah.
And you just wouldn't get that now because the sort of thresholds and ballots that unions have to meet to ensure that their workers are going out on strike legally. You have to get a 50% threshold just to go out on strike. The idea of workers from other sectors just coming out on sympathy strikes, I think, is a long way off. But I mean, I was born in the 90s, and I've never seen a scale of unrest this big. I think it's the 1980s, 1979 Winter of Discontent was the second largest event of disruption that's happened. I think we're a long way off a general strike, but certainly the biggest scale of unrest in the last sort of 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's why it's being called the Winter of Discontent. I was born shortly before the last Winter of Discontent because I'm much, much older and more grizzled than you, Ash. And I can remember the mid-80s and Scargill and the miners' strikes and Orgreave and Wapping. And there was a lot of unpleasantness during all of that, I can recall. And that was ideological as well, on both sides to some extent. Michael says, we're once again going to have a winter of discontent. Perhaps you might have a general strike in the sense that it's just general striking going on, as opposed to a union going out in sympathy with another union. It would actually just be that everyone's managed to meet the 50% ballot threshold, and you just end up with strikes in all general directions, and we'll be calling it a general strike perhaps, but we'll have to wait and see, won't we? Let's hope everyone gets through the winter without being too badly affected by that, especially if you need to go to hospital for anything.